Now I'm very pleased to introduce today's guest speaker, Pete Buttigieg, U.S. Secretary of Transportation. Pete Buttigieg took office in January 2021 as the 19th U.S. Secretary of Transportation. Prior to joining the Biden-Harris administration, Secretary Buttigieg served 2 terms as mayor of his hometown of South Bend, Indiana. A graduate of Harvard University and a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, Secretary Buttigieg served for 7 years as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve, taking a leave of absence from the mayor's office for a deployment in Afghanistan in 2014. In South Bend, Mayor Pete, as he was known, worked across the aisle to transform the city's future and improve residents' everyday lives. And in 2019, Secretary Buttigieg launched a historic campaign for president, and in 2021 made history as the first openly gay person confirmed to serve in a president's cabinet. Secretary Buttigieg lives with his husband, Chaston, and their rescue dogs, Buddy and Truman. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Pete Buttigieg to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Keep your seats, please. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for the warm welcome. Thank you, Jim. Thank you for the introduction, and to Crain's Business for having me today. There's no better place to talk about infrastructure than Chicago. This is a city that screams infrastructure. It's the city of the floating foundation. It's the city of O'Hare and Midway. It's a city whose very existence is based on the vision of how transportation infrastructure can move people and goods about. One of the best pieces of writing about a city ever, which is both grim and admiring, is Nelson Algren's work about the city of Chicago. He called it a city that was to roll boulevards down out of pig wallows and roll its dark river uphill. It was to forge out of steel and blood-red neon its own particular wilderness. And that's definitely how I felt a little bit daunted by Chicago and admiring of it when we used to come over on trips looking at it out the back seat of the family car coming up the toll road from South Bend. So it's a great place and a great moment for us to have a conversation about where we're headed. I'll be very brief now, but because I want to get to the conversation, but thought I would just lay a quick outline of what we're up to. And I'll start with the why, because it's easy to forget why we do this work. And it's not only important in terms of the way that enormous things like world-class cities rest on transportation infrastructure, but also because of how personal transportation is. And the most moving conversations that I've had since I got this job, traveling around the country, talking to people about what the future of transportation might mean to them, are about how the transportation systems they count on either do or don't work for them. And there's a fair amount of horror stories that you hear. I've talked to people from the community of Roseland on the south side of Chicago, where there are visions to extend the Red Line, who explained to me how if you live in the public housing community of Altgeld Gardens, it will take you up to an hour and a half to get to a job in the Loop. It was very striking to me because there's a town of Roseland, Indiana, close to South Bend, where that's how long it takes you to get to the Loop if you have the good fortune of having a car. So it shows what we're up against in terms of the inequities in transportation in this country. But it's even more personal than that, because the daily commute, of course, is something that is intimately intertwined with the rhythms of our family life. I talked to a transportation advocate who told me that she wasn't the mother that she wanted to be, because there wasn't the right kind of connection between her home where she could afford to live and her workplace. But those are the things we get to work on now, at this moment, when we have the most significant and consequential investment in transportation infrastructure in the better part of 100 years now underway. $1.2 trillion in infrastructure investment under the President's bipartisan infrastructure law, of which about half is going to transportation. So I'll just briefly characterize what we think success looks like, and then a quick word about what it's going to take. And then we can have the conversation. What success looks like is that we will have delivered a safer transportation system for everyone, so that the idea of having a friend or a loved one killed in a car crash, for example, which I imagine every single one of us can say is true, and that we're used to, as if we were living in a country going through a war, would instead seem as antiquated and strange as having a friend or a family member lost to cholera. We could do that if we use this generational investment the right way. If we succeed, we will create a generation of family wealth. And I don't mean the same thing as wealthy families. What I mean is the kind of wealth that enables a family to pay off a mortgage or be in a position to put a kid through school. That level of wealth could be created for an entire generation of Americans, largely including those who have been excluded in the past from participation, often in construction and transportation, because of the volume of work that we are about to do if we ensure that everybody is cut in on it. From the kinds of businesses that get to participate in this work to the kinds of workers who are hired. Success looks like being able to point to the early 2020s as the beginning of how we decarbonized the part of our economy which puts the most greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is in fact transportation, and began to do the accelerated work that was needed in order to avoid the loss of millions of lives and trillions of dollars in property that is now already underway, but could still be prevented from being as harmful as it would be if we don't meet the climate challenge at the moment. Success means that this will be a fairer country, where transportation is never an obstacle between somebody and where they need to be. And success, of course, means, and this is a big part of the motivation for the bill, that America's role as the world's leading economy will be secure for the balance of the 21st century. That's what we could do if we get it right. And as I say often to my colleagues, we're done with the hard part, and now we're undertaking the really hard part. Right? The hard part was getting the funding, getting Congress to authorize $1.2 trillion on a bipartisan basis. Getting Congress to do anything on a bipartisan basis, I thought was pretty special, and I think a reflection of the urgency of the need as well as the work that we did, led by the President, to make it happen. But now we actually have to deliver. And that's where so much of the actual work will fall not to those of us who are in the Department of Transportation guiding these dollars out to where they need to be, but ultimately to the civic and private sectors of the economies of the different parts of this country, notably those who are in this room right now. So that's what I'm looking forward to discussing. That's why I'm very pleased to be with you right now. And with that, unless somebody tells me what to do, I will transport myself over to that chair and begin the conversation.
Thank you again, Secretary. We're thrilled to have you with us today. Joining the Secretary today is Crain's political columnist, Greg Hines. An award-winning reporter, Greg joined Crain's in 1996 and also writes frequently on public policy issues such as education, transportation, and economic development. He's a great colleague, dogged reporter, as many of you know in this room, and an exceptional moderator. So I hope you will all enjoy today's discussion. So Greg, take it away.
Nice to see you again. Same here. Mr. Secretary, as we get started, let me make an apology up front if I refer to you as Mayor Pete in the course of this conversation.
I always take that as a compliment. Thank you.
And if I'll doubly apologize if I happen to refer to you as President Pete.
Don't get me in trouble, sir.
Some of this conversation. It's a little early, but it has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Let me start by picking up on something you said. There are a few people on the planet who've had the opportunity to administer the better part of $1.2 trillion for infrastructure work, but passing the bill is only the first step. I still hear tales about how shovel-ready projects that were approved under the Obama stimulus plan aren't done yet. What are you going to do? What's the department doing? What do these folks need to do to expedite it so the money actually gets out the door?
So our job is to build good stuff well. And part of that is to build good stuff quickly. But if you have to choose between doing it quickly and doing it well, you got to do it well. So our focus right now is very different from 2009. Remember when we heard about shovel-ready projects, when that phrase came into our vocabulary? That was a moment where the stimulus was a response to collapsing demand and extremely high unemployment, which meant that we needed to get as much money into the economy as we possibly could, as quickly as we responsibly could. Right now, we have our share of economic challenges, but high unemployment is not one of them. Collapsing demand is not one of them either. And so what we need to do is responsibly move these dollars out, which means in some regards hard hats on construction sites this year, but also means crafting this so that it makes sense over the years to come. We've got about 5 years of funding, which I think represents really a decade of work. And this has to be an infrastructure decade. We're done with Infrastructure Week. Infrastructure Week was declared so often it became a punchline. And now we have to actually deliver. And so you will hear sometimes about shovel-ready projects, but our real focus is on shovel-worthy projects. What's going to make the biggest difference for American competitiveness, success, the things I mentioned earlier, equity, the climate challenge, economic strength, safety, in a way that we're going to be proud of when my kids, who just turned 9 months old yesterday, are very likely still depending on the infrastructure that we're about to build right here in this decade.
So you refer to the decade. Should that be taken as an indication that you hope to have, for the most part, have this money expended within the next 10 years?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we've already got $79 billion made available. I carry this little card around. I've taken this habit from my boss because it's difficult to even keep track of the number of new programs that have been stood up. But just to give you a flavor of what the rest of May is going to look like, we'll do the Transit-Oriented Development Pilot Program, followed by the University Centers, Transportation Centers Program, then $200 million for natural gas distribution. A lot of folks don't know that's part of among the things we work on. We just released $1 billion for Safe Streets and Roads for All, to be followed by the nationally significant federal lands and tribal project program, and then the Bridge Investment Program. That's the month of May. And these announcements will continue literally on a weekly basis for certainly as long as I have this job. And the challenge, again, is how to do it swiftly, but most importantly of all, how to do it well.
My bike needs a couple new tires. Maybe I'll file a grant application. Let's talk about logistics, supply chain. Everybody in this room now knows that the nation faces a real problem with inflation. The president talked about it here yesterday. Part of the reason for that is people can't get the stuff they need in any kind of a timely order. You can't do anything about the situation in Ukraine. You can't get China's factories to reopen if the Chinese government wants to close them. But what does this project do? What does this bill do, this package do, to improve the ability of manufacturers and suppliers and everybody else to get the things they need in a timely way?
So what we have to do is work every angle of the problem simultaneously, because the very nature of supply chains and goods movement in this country is extremely interconnected. Now let's distinguish between two kinds of problems: a supply chain problem and just a plain supply problem. So when you're talking about a factory shutdown in China, that's obviously a little different from the transportation issues, because you can't ship something that hasn't been produced. But we also do have issues in our goods movement systems, big ones, across each of our modes of transportation. In trucking, the issue is we don't have enough people driving trucks. And there are some very specific reasons for that, not least the lack of truck parking, the fact that while some truckers are very well compensated, many are not. The fact that it turns out in a system where truckers are paid by the load or by the mile, not by the hour, nobody pays for wasting a trucker's time at a port gate or at a warehouse except the trucker. So that's just to take one kind of family of issues. There's the trucking side, there's the rail side. We've been working with all of the Class 1 railroads on enhancing fluidity there. There's the port side. We're making long-term investments, but in the short term, we found things like instituting a fine, even threatening to institute a fine, actually, for the ocean shippers and others who had these boxes piling up. Had an almost miraculous effect on the number of containers that were dwelling for a long time in places like the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. Fell by half. So it's working all of those issues on the ground in terms of the fluidity of goods movement. And then looking at all the other things that are driving costs up, some of which we do control. So, yeah, our level of control over the crisis in Ukraine is obviously measured or limited. For that matter, the price of gas. Obviously, if an oil company had to call the president and ask what the price of gas ought to be before they decide what to charge every hour, things would be a little different than they are. But in addition to the things that have been done to try to stabilize oil markets, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the international coordination on that, and other measures there, the ethanol flexibility that the president laid out. There are also other things that we could act right away to do something about, to lower the cost of prescription drugs, to get Congress to agree with the majority of the American people that Medicare ought to be able to negotiate something like that, to cap the price of insulin at $35, which was something that the House was prepared to do. There was almost unified Republican opposition, but could be done and would be very helpful, especially for families that are facing insulin and gas prices.
That's a little more controversial, though, than making supply chains work better.
Not by much. I mean, maybe in Washington, yeah, but out among the American people, the idea that Medicare ought to be able to negotiate prescription drugs.
Have you made any progress out in the Long Beach, Los Angeles area where there were some early efforts to speed up?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the, there's more work to do, but that's one of the areas where we were able to see the share of long dwell containers gumming up the system fall by half. Now, because we just directed a $52.5 million grant to the Port of Long Beach for on-dock rail, 10,000 feet of rail that's going to allow containers to be loaded. That's great, but it's not going to be ready by July. So we have to work these other tools that we have and recognize that sometimes if you see a ship waiting too long off the coast of Long Beach, that's actually because of an issue in a rail yard outside of Chicago or trucking availability in Nebraska.
Let's talk about that. As you correctly point out, they're shipping supply chain problems in the Los Angeles area. We have a lot of surface transportation problems here in Chicago, where famously it takes longer to get a freight train from one end of town to the other than it does to get it here from the coast. What are you looking for out of this infrastructure package in that regard in particular? It's CREATE is the program, for those who know.
Exactly, yeah. So CREATE is an example of a collaboration that is mobilizing both public resources and the freight railroads that are stepping up to expand the ability of these resources to move goods. Another thing that we're doing alongside of that is the data sharing. You might assume that a beneficial cargo owner has the same amount of information about a pallet of goods coming on a ship as you and I have on let's say an Amazon package that's making its way to us. It's actually not true. In fact, if we were to take the analogy of passenger travel, often the situation would be equivalent to knowing that your cousin is going to be landing on a plane in Chicago, but you're not actually sure whether it's O'Hare or Midway, and you know what week but not what day they're coming in. And certainly not what time. And you may or may not know what airline. That's kind of what it's like sometimes because the different players, the terminal operators, the ports, the cargo owners, the railroads, the warehouses, the trucks, don't have the data that actually talks to each other.
So what are you going to do about that?
We're getting them to share. So we launched a program called FLOW, Freight Logistics Optimization Works. We have a lot of acronyms in federal government, I'm finding. But the point is to get these players talking to each other. So some of the early people to the table included the ports themselves, the people who control the chassis, which there's a shortage of, cargo owners like Land O'Lakes or Albertsons or True Value, getting all of them participating together. We can't make them do it. It's all voluntary. But it's you bring data, you get data. And this isn't proprietary data, but it's also data that people haven't been in the habit of sharing.
So should we expect some serious money for CREATE projects, great separation projects out of this?
The voice of my general counsel is ringing in my ear. While I cannot speak to a specific project application, there is no doubt in my mind that there will be very competitive applications coming from Chicagoland for CREATE and other purposes. Look, we got CRISI, that's all kinds of, I don't even remember what that acronym stands for, but it is one of our most well-resourced tools for improving rail fluidity, which, by the way, will also benefit passenger trains that run on those rail lines. We have a railroad crossing elimination program. This is more of an issue in rural areas, but a very big issue in rural areas where, if that train is in the way, and some of my northern Indiana friends might have experience with this, that train is in the way, you've got a very long way to go to get around it. But, of course, also an issue for goods movement, fluidity, and supply chains. So, short answer, having given the long one already, is yes, these dollars will be very helpful for rail fluidity in this region.
Let me talk about a transportation problem that doesn't directly involve this package for a moment. Big city mass transportation systems, CTA, MTA, New York, have had an awful lot of problem with security coming out of COVID. Crime rates are up. The kinds of things that happen there that discourage and frighten a lot of passengers. I realize this is mostly a local problem, but what can the federal government do to make people feel safe riding the bus and the train again?
Yeah. Look, this is going to be a very important part of the recovery of transit. We are way down even now. We're getting there on buses, but on light rail and on subways, we are a very long way from recovering the ridership that we used to have. Now, part of that has to do with commuting patterns, but one of the biggest things that has to change is safety or the perception of safety. Now, first of all, the reality, right? We need to make sure that it is safe and that we're not seeing these kinds of incidents that are happening. There are limits, obviously, to how much a transportation department gets involved in some of the things that are more a local law enforcement issue. But we do want to make sure that we at least are supporting design features. Something sometimes as basic as lighting or as complex as capitalizing station design that tends towards safety. I will also mention, though, and this is not to wave away the safety concerns that are real, but this is another part of the puzzle, at least in the short to medium term, about the safety of our transportation system writ large, which is that the fatality rate of just being in a car in this country is shockingly high. And pound for pound, right now, just with those rates, simply having more people choose to take transit in and of itself would mean a reduction in the number of people who lose their lives in transportation in this country. It's that stark of a difference.
Interesting. Let me see if I can set off your general counsel's spidey sense again. There's a little airport up the road called O'Hare.
Heard of it?
Yeah, it's one of the international hubs of the business. Two questions. How well is O'Hare positioned to get some money towards its ongoing gate expansion and modernization program? And two, can you shed any light on when the FAA might finally sign off on that? It's been in environmental review for quite a while. You get a little sense of anxiousness from city officials that they'd like to be done with it so they can get going.
Yeah. So I don't have any news to make on the latter, but obviously, O'Hare is a very, very important economic engine. So important that it's of national and not just local or regional significance. And yes, my expectation is between our airport improvement program, our airport terminal program, possibly our mega projects fund, which is designed for things that are just too big or too complicated to do well in the regular grant-making cycle, that we will see some compelling applications that are related to O'Hare. And look, part of what O'Hare did was connect Chicago to a global economy and make Chicago a successful global city. That's the power of a piece of transportation infrastructure. And it is inspiring to see the plans and the visions that exist now for taking it to the next level.
One of the core tensions in what you're trying to do is spur climate change and spur dealing with climate change. At the same time, the dominant mode of transportation continues to be road-based. How do you handle that tension? Some of the road builders are saying, "Hey, we're putting too much money into pretty-sounding things that don't help us." Some of the climate folks say that we're not doing enough. Don't waste money on asphalt and internal combustion modes of transportation. How are you working through that?
So, roads are going to be a very, very important part of the American transportation system for as long as we live, just to state the obvious. We've got, I think, $11 billion headed to Illinois alone for roads and highways in the next 5 years through this bill. How you use them really matters from a climate perspective, though. So there are obviously places where a road expansion is justified or is needed. But there are also places where if you expand a road, what will happen is 4 years from now, you will have induced so much demand that you will have the exact same amount of congestion and twice as much pollution. So the first thing we got to do is be smart about creating options. So yes, fluid road systems, but also alternatives like transit, like active transportation, like quality passenger rail, so that you don't have to bring 2 tons of metal with you everywhere you go. And that is as much about creating choices for people as it is about shifting people away from more carbon-intensive modes of transportation. Now, the other thing we got to do, of course, is make sure that we reduce the environmental impact of the car trips that do happen. That's why the EV work is so important. Now, our view is that and it's very clear that the auto industry is going electric no matter what. That's all but been decided. The companies are moving in that direction, from the startups and the Silicon Valley companies, the Teslas that were there to begin with, to the big three Detroit OEMs. What's not certain is three things that I think won't happen unless we have the right policies. One, does it happen fast enough to deal with climate change? Two, does it happen on an equitable basis, so that some of the people who would benefit the most from the gas savings that come with having an electric car, low-income people, are actually able to take advantage of that opportunity? And third, is this electric vehicle revolution going to be made in America? And obviously, as a child of the industrial Midwest who grew up in the shadow of an empty Studebaker factory that taunted and haunted the downtown of South Bend for my entire youth, I spent a lot of time thinking about how we ensure that the U.S. is leading, not catching up, on the EV revolution that's happening in the automotive sector. So what do we do to make sure those three things happen? That it's quick enough, that it's equitable enough, and that it's made in America? Well, that's where we've got to take the obstacles off the table. And one of the biggest obstacles is range anxiety. The idea that when you get in the car and you're headed somewhere, you won't actually be able to charge up. You can take a road trip anywhere in the country, and you know on the interstate system you're going to be able to fill up. That perception is not there, and in some cases the reality is not quite there on the electric side. That's why we're putting $7.5 billion into electric vehicle chargers, and doing it in a way that promotes those chargers being made in America, and looking at the opportunity to install those chargers for electrical workers who will have the kind of training and the kind of pay and benefits and the opportunity to join a union that is the stuff of middle-class incomes.
In the case of EVs, you're kind of swimming with the stream. Detroit clearly wants to go in that direction. They want help going in that direction. Everybody's kind of on the same page. But
I wouldn't say everybody. I got some interesting questions about this in Congress the other day. Ironically, from representatives who serve rural areas that I think are going to be some of the ones that benefit the most. I mean, if you just back up and think about it, I know culturally EVs read as, something for city dwellers in blue cities with little cars going around to their Democrat stuff, listening to NPR. I don't know, that's kind of the cultural feel of it, right? But actually, if you're in rural America, that's when you drive the longest distances, which means you burn the most gas or diesel, and you're going to save the most money from filling up on electrons, which is cheaper than filling up on gas or diesel. Plus, you are more likely to live in a single-family home, which means, if we can just demystify charging infrastructure for a second, DC fast chargers, we've got to get more of them out there. Level 2 chargers, you got to install them. But you already have some amount of charging infrastructure in your house if you got a single-family home. It's called the plug-in-your-wall. And so a big opportunity is actually in some of the places whose politicians seem to be the most hostile to the idea. I didn't mean to derail us.
No, it's all right. I guess what I'm getting at, though, is at least with the big companies, there's kind of a consensus on the wider issue of, I hate to go back to roads versus non-roads, but how do you make this a plus rather than an either-or?
Sorry, which is the either and which is the or? You're talking about the transit and the roads.
Putting money into things other than the traditional roads.
So look, part of what we got to do, we've got to mitigate the impact of trips, right? That's what going to EV does. So you're taking the same car trip between the same two places. Now it's going to have less climate impact. We've also got to shift the modes that those trips take place in. So if you have the option, a good option, a safe, convenient, reliable option to make that same trip on a bus or on the L, maybe you're going to do that. We got to make that easier. That's why we're investing so much in transit. I would argue that there were two climate titles in the infrastructure law. The one that was called the climate title, and then the one that was called the transit title, because that's how much of a difference. I mean, just think about it, right? The people in this room would fit on, 4 subway cars. Now imagine how much space it would take up if each of the people in this room was in a single occupancy car, right? And think about how many square feet that would be, right? So there's huge benefits in terms of congestion as well as emissions to getting people on transit. And then the thing that we need to be a little more visionary about is making some of those trips less necessary to begin with. So it's one thing to say, if I'm at point A and I got to get to point B, how do we decarbonize that? But another part of it is, do we design our cities around human life and then have our transportation policy fit that? Or do we design our cities around a piece of transportation, like a car? And from the 50s, we did more the latter. So what we need to start doing, and I should be more humble about that, what has started happening and what we need to be better at doing in the federal government, because our org chart doesn't exactly match this, is think about housing and transportation at the same time. That's why we're doing transit-oriented development.
Do you think that cities, dense conglomerations, as opposed to more spread out suburbs, are cities going to come back after what we've learned from this pandemic?
I think so.
Should they come back?
I'll tell you, of course. Because there's nothing like them in terms of the ability to create the chance encounters with human beings who aren't quite like you that leads to the spark of creativity. There's a reason why more patents and intellectual property come out of cities proportionally by orders of magnitude than less dense areas. It's those little collisions that happen. And I don't know how it's been for you all. I'm still shaking off rust in terms of what it's like to speak to a room full of people who are actually, you can actually see their faces largely and body language. We've mostly been in an environment where you could, if you were lucky, you could either get body language or you could get facial expressions, but you couldn't have both. And we're kind of getting back into this, right, haltingly, and obviously there are many reasons and scenarios where many of us are still wearing masks and we're still doing a lot of Zooms. But what I found is that I had felt like in that grayscale version of life that we were living through 2021, that we were missing out on something like 30% of the richness of the interactions. And now I'm convinced it was more like 70%, now that we're back at it, sort of back at it. And I think in the end, for that reason, we need cities more than we ever did. They may emerge on different terms. I think commuting will never quite be the same. There's no reason to push ourselves back into the patterns of convening and commuting that we had in 2019. But still, at the end of the day, people need to be around people.
Well, you will have my vote forever if you can guarantee I'll never have to do another Zoom meeting. We have this thing called Amtrak. There's a lot of money in there for Amtrak. There's a little bit in there for high-speed rail, however you define that. But it looks like a whole chunk of the money is dedicated to the East Coast and to the Acela corridor, rather than to, say, out in this part of the world where Amtrak's mid-continent base is out of Chicago. Mm-hmm. Are we going to get a fair share of that, though?
Yes. You should know this. This is important. A chunk of it is going to the Northeast Corridor, but a big chunk of it is not. And there has to be a robust national network. Look, the Northeast Corridor is where you have the level of ridership and revenue that has helped Amtrak, or had helped Amtrak pre-COVID, put itself basically in a position to actually be operating in the black. Not that a rail operator should have to, because the whole point of investing publicly in rail, just as we invest publicly in roads and airports, is that there's a community and macroeconomic benefit. So just to be clear, it doesn't have to run like a business. But they were actually getting to where they were operating in the black, largely because of the density on the Northeast Corridor. Obviously, we don't have that yet across the entire national network. But we could. And so what we have to do, and what we can do, thanks to the funding in the infrastructure law, which is the most we've had for Amtrak since Amtrak was created, is to take care of the maintenance backlog, to upgrade the rolling stock, that's the locomotives and the passenger cars, to address the condition of the rights-of-way themselves, and to look at introducing some new routes that are needed to increase the frequency and the level of service. I would be lying if I sat here and said that with those funds we're going to have a national high-speed rail network. It's going to be a down payment from a high-speed rail perspective.
So we're talking faster rail rather than high-speed rail.
We're going to start with reliable rail. Although I will emphasize one thing that's important, which is that the on-time performance of Amtrak is largely, if not mostly, a consequence of the freight rail lines that Amtrak shares the rail with in many cases. Not the Acela corridor, obviously, but around here. And so we're working with the rail Class 1 freight railroads on that. And the Surface Transportation Board will hold them accountable for their legal responsibility to let passenger traffic through.
I hear a lot of talk about that amongst local transportation people. Senator Durbin has been in a crusade for years about rapacious big railroads that squish Metro and other passenger users. Can we expect some guidance? Can we expect some legislation from this administration that would deal with that?
So, yes. It's actually, the legislation's there. The enforcement has been reinvigorated. So what you have is, right now, by law, this is part of how Amtrak got set up. A lot of folks don't know this. The passenger rail has to be allowed through. But it hasn't always happened. So what has begun happening now, under guidance from the administration, is that the Class 1 freight railroads are required to disclose and publish the data about on-time performance. And the Surface Transportation Board is going to look at it quarterly. And we're just getting that data populated. And look, I want this to be a win-win. I want there to be great stories about how freight railroads have stepped up to make sure that there's good passenger fluidity. And perhaps made it unnecessary to take any enforcement action. But any way you cut it, we need to improve where we are.
Is win-win realistic to expect, or at some point you're just going to have to say no, you're going to have to go along with the program?
Well, look, the law is the law. I mean, you've got to let this passenger traffic through. But if there was ever a season for a win-win, it's a season in which we're investing billions of dollars in enhancements to our rails that will benefit freight and passenger rail alike. So I remain a believer in the win-win path. At the end of the day, it's got to happen.
The head of American Airlines was out here yesterday, and he was talking about how a recovery at O'Hare has been somewhat slower than some of the other big airports in the country, in part because international traffic hasn't come back. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons for that is, and I've got to face this myself, my partner and I are supposed to take a trip to Europe this summer, and everybody's nightmare is you get stuck in Brussels or Bogota or whatever, and you test positive, and oh my goodness, how are we going to get back? How long are we going to be stuck here? What is the status of regulations, American regulations, that require people to not only have proof of vaccination but be tested before they can get back into this country? And do you expect that's going to change?
So the logic of the pre-departure testing was that we needed a way to move out of the what I would call the meat cleaver approach that we had early on, which was a policy that was based on, it was country-based. So early on, you had these 212F restrictions under the State Department. Basically said, if you're coming from this country or that country or that country or that country, you just can't come in. Which, of course, didn't really reflect the risk profiles of individual passengers. And that fact became more glaring as we got more and more people vaccinated. So now it's evolved into one that's about the specific situation of the passenger. Right, your vaccination status and your test status, instead of just what country you happen to be traveling from, or even what country your passport happens to be from, which is, again, a very blunt instrument for keeping COVID under control. It's still a restriction, and I do not think that it will be there forever. It will require a level of confidence from the CDC that relaxing it would not harm the progress that we've made against the virus.
So do you expect it will be there for this travel season?
Well, I'm going to Germany next week for the meeting of transportation ministers. I'm pretty sure it'll be in effect then. But I don't know how much longer.
I realize that...
What day is your vacation? I
realize that is not within your control. There's this thing called CDC. But I do think there is this great uncertainty that certainly affects business travelers. Yeah. I mean, they can't afford to be stuck someplace for 2 weeks. Yeah. And they just don't know, when are we going to get a firm answer? And I don't hear a firm answer, except it's coming.
I don't have one for you yet.
One of the features of this transportation package, of the infrastructure package, is there's a lot more competitive grants than in previous ones, as opposed to formula money where everybody gets a certain share. There's a lot of big pots of money that are competitive. Unfortunately, this region, the Chicago region, has a reputation of not playing terribly well together when it comes to uniting and getting on the same page and submitting joint applications where all the officials check off what they need rather than everybody running to their favorite congressman to pull strings. How important is it that this region get its act together, and what readings can you give us as to whether we are or are not?
Well, regional alignment is definitely good for business. It makes it easier for us to be a good partner to project sponsors on the ground who are trying to get stuff done. One thing I will note about Illinois is that there has already been this major investment decision in this state to invest in infrastructure. And if I could dwell on it for a second, I hope nobody thinks, oh, why did we do all that with our state money when the federal government was going to come in and finally do national infrastructure? We should have just held out. It's important for you to understand that decision, and I've shared this with the governor as well, who I know was very adamant in bringing this through. That decision simply means that Illinois communities are better positioned to take advantage of the federal dollars because the plans will be more advanced. Some of the work will already be done. It really sets up this state well. Now, working across jurisdictional lines, state, county, city, working across state lines, since you are obviously close to some state lines, all of that certainly benefits this region. And I've seen a lot of evidence of that. I've spoken with the mayor.
But are we doing it now better than we used to?
Yes.
I mean, my impression is still Illinois people, for instance, kind of turn up their nose about, oh, in Indiana, we can't get that involved.
Well, never turn up your nose at Indiana. That's never a good idea. No, I would say I've certainly seen evidence of real movement toward that kind of alignment, and I strongly encourage that continue. Because again, for us as a federal partner, we need to know that when we're working on these complex projects, we're going to have a cohesive partner to work with. And a lot of the most interesting mega projects that are being considered across the country do work across jurisdictional lines, state lines, party lines, right? Some of the biggest bridges literally go over a state line. So this is a time for, and I always found when I was mayor that nothing helped us coordinate with our neighbors better than a big pot of gold somewhere. And my hope is that the infrastructure law, among many other things, will have that effect.
You mentioned in your opening remarks equity.
Yep.
You've referred to it a couple times, a desire to make sure that money just doesn't go into selected pockets, but
yes,
serves the broader population. How important is it that particularly applying for some of these mega projects, and I can think of a bunch of potential mega projects here that might have an equity component, rebuilding the Blue Line with extending a transit line west, rebuilding Lakeshore Drive in such a way that you have more park space, you have a buffer against rising lake levels because of climate, extending the Red Line south. All those have an equity component. How is it important if you really want to compete and get this money that there be an equity component?
Very. And we have been very transparent about this in our grant criteria. And the reason is that you can't say it's a good transportation project if it's going to make some people worse off while making others better off. And sadly, that is part of the story of American transportation. So let me break this in two. First, the projects, and then how the projects are delivered. So the projects themselves. Every place I go in this country, when I talk about that highway that was built in such a way that it tore right through a black neighborhood, or that rail line that separates the quote-unquote good from the quote-unquote bad side of town, faces nod. People know. They picture, and it's everywhere. It's not just a southern thing or a northern thing. It's everywhere. So the simple fact is federal dollars were used in ways that often serve to divide rather than to reconnect. We can do something about that. I don't raise this issue to make people feel guilty. I raise this issue because we can do something about it. We have a specific fund, a Reconnecting Communities program, a pilot program that we got $1 billion for in this bill to help us identify projects that are specifically of that nature. And I think the application phase alone, I suspect, will be a real eye-opener. Just seeing how many communities come to us with a story and a case saying this happened to us. And then a plan for what to do about it. Maybe you got to cap and stitch an entire highway so that you can get across it. Maybe it's something a little lighter touch, like transit, to get around it, or some other mitigation. But we know that this is an issue. We know that equity is at stake in examples like the potential extension of the Red Line or any of the other things that you just mentioned here in Chicago and, again, everywhere around the country. So our people serve well. By the way, there's also environmental justice issues here, right? If we can electrify a port where there are low-income communities with kids who have measurably higher asthma rates because of the emissions that are coming out of the ships that are in the port and the trucks that are around there. That is a public health justice issue that we can do something about just by having better transportation policy. So that's going to have to be by the way, also safety. The rates for the whole country are going in the wrong direction in terms of lives lost on our roadways, but they're going more quickly in the wrong direction for tribal communities, for Black and Latino Americans, and we have to reverse this trend. So there's everything about equity in terms of what we do. What is the policy? Who is served by this transportation system? But then there's also the how we get there. And I actually started my day with the NMSDC, the National Minority Supplier Development Council. They're having a convening today that they aim to be sort of the minority business community's answer to Davos. And what we were talking about there was the opportunity, as $1.2 trillion moved through the economy, to not just better utilize the capacity that is there. In other words, minority-owned businesses that exist in transportation and construction, these things. But to take responsibility for growing that capacity. Because this is a big enough investment that it should do that. This is what we really have to get serious about. And the reason I think this is just as important a message for this audience as it is for the minority-specific focused audience this morning is that everybody's got to be part of this. It will be very important for us to engage some of the incumbent companies, whether we're talking about transportation and construction or airlines or anybody else, to ask what they in turn are doing to engage and empower other businesses. Whether we're talking about construction or whether we're talking about professional services, which are actually higher margin and also important. Right? Is there diversity among your accountants and your bankers and your consultants and your engineers and your architects? And definitely is there diversity among the hard hats working on the construction sites, because we cannot have a generational, once-in-a-century level construction season and again have this phenomenon of people in the neighborhood who finally get the infrastructure project in their neighborhood looking around at the work site saying, wait a minute, not one person in a hard hat on this work site looks like they come from anywhere near this neighborhood. We can't let that happen again. So making good on that means being transparent about how much we care about that in the projects that we're literally picking and choosing in my building, those discretionary ones you mentioned.
Sure.
2, acknowledging that for every dollar we have that's discretionary, there's more dollars that are formula. So we need to engage the states and the cities that are doing a lot of the spending. And we need to engage the private sector, the business community. Because it's not good enough if we get 20 years from now, we say, well, what happened in the early 2020s? Say, well, if you look at Chicagoland or some region, I'm making up these numbers as an example, 3% of the businesses in construction were black-owned. And, we managed to use 3.1%, so good for us. We have to say, did the capacity grow? That's the level of ambition I think we should have. And we've got to engage labor. Labor unions that we've had some really constructive conversations about how to make sure that those extraordinary pathways into the middle class that are represented by the building and construction trades who are about to get more work headed their way than has ever been possible in our lifetimes, that we are counting on them to draw people from communities that have been excluded. And just one last, I know I'm going long here, just one last point on this. I'm not just saying this because it's the right thing to do from an equity perspective, though it is, and that is more than enough reason. I'm saying this because the question is now being called on the supply side. Right? We got the money. And now the question is, can America actually deliver on this much work? Do we have the supply chains? Do we have the raw materials? Do we have the companies? Do we have the business space? Do we have the
That was
workers?
the threshold question here. Can you get this money out the door?
Right. So one of the biggest answers to that threshold question is we can get it done on one condition, well, many conditions, but one of the most important conditions is that we not leave any talent on the table.
2 other quick questions. What role did toll roads, as opposed to roads that are paid for with gasoline taxes, where do they fit into this new world we're entering?
Sounds like a great question for state and local leaders to really
Oh, how about national leaders?
No, I don't mean to be flip. Look, we have to find ways to mobilize private capital because even the enormous sums that are being talked about here are frankly, if that's all we had, would not be enough to meet the need for infrastructure investment in this country. And so there are circumstances where I think they're called for. We're not going to put a thumb on the scale. We're not going to stop things from happening that a community or a state wants to do, provided they meet all of the requirements we have there. But it can't be an end run around our expectations on environmental or labor benefit. And it can't just be outsourcing the political will to raise revenue, because I think if you do that in the long run, it'll catch up to you. So can they play a role? Sure. I mean, I grew up taking the toll road to Chicago anytime we came over from South Bend. But I don't believe system-wide that is a substitute for gathering the revenue that is needed to fund the transportation system that America deserves, because the whole thing about public goods, by their very definition, is that they are worth having collectively, even if they're not profitable for any one individual owner. And if something were profitable
so supplemental but not controlling.
Yeah, we can go with that.
Last question, because we're about out of time here. Much as $1.2 trillion sounds like it is an unimaginable amount of money. You didn't get everything you wanted. There's other stuff that needs to be done. What's on your wish list if Congress were to revisit this issue? What would you like to see done in this vein that didn't get taken care of in this package?
Well, I don't want to sound greedy, because we
I give
really
you the opportunity.
Okay, because we really will be racing to deliver the resources that have been entrusted to us and make them work. But let me mention a couple other things that are going to be important. One, it remains important to work the second half of the electric vehicle equation. What I mean by that is we work the charging half, right? We're doing a charging network across the country. But what we haven't got done yet is establish the kind of incentive or tax credit that's going to lower the prices. And from an equity perspective and an acceleration perspective, we've got to make sure that the upfront sticker cost is not a barrier to buying this vehicle that will then save you money the longer you own it, because it's cheaper to maintain and cheaper to fill up. So it would be very helpful to get that done. And I think there's a lot of, the House passed it. There's still a lot of interest in it. The other thing that didn't get done...
Hopefully we can do it without making Elon Musk any richer, but that's a side point.
I'm sure he'll be fine either way. The other thing, though, that I think wasn't ripe for this infrastructure law, but by the time we have another one, it's going to be front and center, is getting ready for automated vehicles. So I know this sounds like a bit of a mirage. I mean, certainly my experience going back to when I was mayor is that it seemed like the onset of the widespread use of the automated car is exactly 7 years away, and it has been for 10 years. And it will, because it turns out these technological problems are even gnarlier than was originally understood. But it is coming. I mean, these are technologies that are definitely going to be part of our lives. Many of them are on the street right now. And Congress hasn't really taken up the question of how we're supposed to handle this. So, for example, something I never really thought much about before I got this job, there's a division of labor around auto safety. And the division of labor is, we regulate the car, the federal government regulates the car, we got the crash dummies, the tests, the recalls, all of that, right? And the state regulates the driver, the license, the BMV, the process there, right? This is not designed to contemplate what you're supposed to do if the car is the driver. Interestingly, because we only regulate the car, there's actually nothing in our federal regulations that say anybody in particular has to be driving the car. They don't really contemplate that. On the other hand, what they do is they tell you exactly where the mirror needs to go in a driverless car, right? Because you have to meet those safety standards. We actually just changed the vocabulary around the term driver's side and passenger side.
Can't we call George Jetson in?
What's it?
Can't we call George Jetson in?
I don't know if we want him flying or not. But the irony is, by the time they are flying, George isn't going to be driving it. It's going to be driving him or flying him or whatever. So that's kind of the next horizon where we need to have a policy framework. Not to get in the way of this development, but to make sure that it unfolds in an equitable way, in a safe way. And by the way, living in a country where we've just gotten used to the idea that 40,000 people a year die in car crashes. It could be one of the most life-saving triumphs of technology in our time if we get it right. And that's definitely on my to-do list for whether it's as a citizen or as a policymaker for the next time these things come before Congress.
Good idea. On that note, Mr. Secretary, thank you. Appreciate it.